Now this week, you will, after a long time, publish your plans for staffing in the NHS over the long term, the workforce plan as it's described. Now we've seen a draft of that plan that says essentially that you need to double the number of training places for doctors and nurses. Is that what you're going to do?
Well, at the beginning of the year, I set out 5 priorities for the country. One of them was to cut waiting lists, and that's why shortly after becoming Prime Minister, we injected more money into the NHS, record funding, in fact, to help the NHS do that. But I also want to make sure that the NHS is modernised and it's fit for the future, and that's why we're going to do things differently. And this week, we're going to do something that no government has ever done. It's going to be one of the most significant announcements in the history of the NHS, and that is to make sure that it has a long-term workforce plan so that we can hire the doctors, nurses and GPs that we need, not just today, but for years into the future, to provide the care that we all need.
So what does that mean? And if I'm a normal patient, what difference will it make and when?
So what it will represent is the largest expansion in training and workforce in the NHS's history, but it's also going to draw on the latest innovations and techniques to streamline the process from classroom to clinic, because it's right that healthcare adapts and evolve as our needs change, and it will be supporting the NHS. This is the NHS's plan, and it's right that we back them to do it, and it will mean people can have confidence that the doctors and nurses and GPs that we all need will be there, and that we can reduce our reliance on foreign-trained healthcare professionals. I think that's something everyone wants to see. For the first time, this plan shows how we can do that.
But when will ordinary patients see a difference? Because it takes 7 years to train a doctor, 3 years to train a nurse. So again, if I'm an ordinary patient, when will I see a difference?
Well, so I think we should separate into the short term and the long term. I'm Prime Minister that wants to make a difference today, and that's why cutting waiting lists is one of my 5 priorities, and people can already see that difference. Last year, we practically eliminated the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. Recently, we've virtually eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years. If you look at ambulance response times, A&E waiting times, they've improved considerably from Christmas when they were particularly challenging. But you're right, it's also we take the long-term decisions for the years into the future.
You say that what you're doing on waiting lists is already working. In actual fact, the overall number of people waiting is the highest that it has ever been. Targets on routine waiting lists have been missed. Targets on cancer care have been missed. You can pick some selective statistics, but overall, the experience that people are having on waiting lists is dreadful in many cases.
It's because we've had a pandemic, Laura, and the backlog that ensued was always going to take some time to work through.
Many waiting lists were going in the wrong direction well before the pandemic.
I've been here for just over 6 months, and in that time, we've practically eliminated, as I said, last year, the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. We've just recently practically eliminated the number of people waiting 1.5 years, and you've seen an enormous improvement in A&E and ambulance waiting times since they were particularly bad. Yes, that's right. And it will take time for the overall waiting list to come down, because as we've recovered from COVID and people have come back, it was always going to take time. But what I can tell you is that because of our record investment today, because of the plans that we've got in place, we are seeing that waiting lists are coming down for individual people.
Forgive me.
Well, hang on, this is really important. And I've always said the overall waiting list was not going to come down until next year. That was always the case. But between now and then, we can start to eliminate the number of people waiting a very long time. And then we are making progress on that.
But it sounds a little bit like you're wanting us to believe in some kind of parallel universe. So you say again and again, we are cutting waiting lists, except you've just then admitted that the overall waiting list isn't coming down. Isn't it important actually to say and to admit that overall waiting lists remain an enormous problem, and people's experience doesn't match up with you saying repeatedly that waiting lists are coming down, because they're not in many cases?
That's literally what I said in January, Laura. When I gave my speech about the 5 priorities, cutting waiting lists is rightly on there because it is a priority for the country, because the waiting lists are too high. People are waiting too long. That's why it's one of my 5 priorities. And I was very clear then about what our timetable was to improve things. And we're delivering against that timetable. And I said very transparently and clearly then in January that the overall waiting list itself was not expected to start coming down until next year. But that doesn't take away from the fact that right now, the NHS, as a result of our investment and the plans that we've put in place, is treating more people than it has ever done. And so it just will take us a little bit of time to work through the backlog that built up during COVID. I think people can see that. But look, if you asked again about specifics, people were waiting completely unacceptably an hour and a half for ambulances over the winter, and that has come down to around half an hour. We're close to 75% of people being seen within 4 hours at A&E. Again, that was not happening in the winter.
So there has been progress.
So there has been progress, but I've always said that these things are not going to happen overnight. They will take time, but I want people to know that this is really important, because we've spent now a lot of time talking about the short term. What we're going to do this week is something about the long term, and governments should make the right long-term decisions for the country. It has never been done before. People have always said the NHS needs a long-term plan, so we hire more doctors, more nurses, more GPs, and yes, I'm not good, I'm not going to, as you say, like, it takes 5, 10, 15 years for these things to come through. That doesn't mean it's the wrong thing for me to do, because I'm focused on doing the right long-term things for the country.
And you've made that clear, but in the context of setting out a big, bold, long-term plan, why should anybody have faith that it will work when right now you can't even reach agreements with junior doctors or nurses to keep them in work? And we know so many staff are leaving the NHS, so why can we believe that your workforce plan actually will make the right kind of difference?
Well, first of all, it's not my plan, it's the NHS's plan. So it's the NHS's long-term workforce plan that I'm pleased the government will be fully supporting and backing. So that's the first thing to say. Now, you talked about pay settlements. I'm really pleased that we've been able to reach agreement with over half a dozen health unions representing over a million.
There's lots of them, and we might be about to have the biggest strike ever.
Hang on, we've reached agreement with over half a dozen NHS unions representing over 1 million NHS workers who accepted our pay deal, which was done a little while ago, and you reported on that. I'm really grateful to all those people for accepting it and for the hard work they do. I had actually the privilege of spending a part of the night shift the other weekend at Watford General Hospital, talking to some of the team there, and they're doing a fantastic work. They deserve our support. But more broadly, right, I have to make difficult decisions as Prime Minister. Everyone can see the context that we're in with inflation and interest rates. Now, I want to prioritise the things that are right for the country. So yes, we're investing in the long-term workforce plan. When it comes to public sector pay, I'm going to do what I think is affordable, what I think is responsible. Now, that may not always be popular in the short term, but it is the right thing for the country.
Let's talk then about that broader economic picture, because lots of our viewers are desperately worried about interest rates. Now, the point of jacking up interest rates is to make it more expensive to borrow, and therefore that means that people will have less money to spend. And it means that people watching this right now are going to hurt. They're going to have less cash to go around. Do you admit that it will be painful for many, many people?
Of course I know that it's a challenging time, and that's why 2 years ago I started talking about the danger of inflation. And that's why earlier this year, when I set out my 5 priorities, what's the first of those? To halve inflation.
I'm asking you a different question though, Prime Minister. And it might be hard to say to people, but I think people look to their Prime Minister for candour and to tell them hard things. Do you admit that there's going to be a lot of financial pain for many, many people? And is it worth it in order to get inflation down?
Inflation, Laura, is the thing that causes people financial pain. Inflation is the enemy. Why? Because inflation eats the pound in your pocket. It makes your paycheck go less far. It eats into your savings. It pushes up prices. It puts at risk jobs and livelihoods. Inflation is the enemy that we need to conquer. That's why
interest rates going up are also an enemy for many people watching this.
Interest rates are a consequence of high inflation. And I think we should be very clear about what is doing damage to people, what is causing people challenges in their day-to-day living and their budgeting is inflation. And it's inflation that needs to be the priority for the government to stamp out, and I'm prepared to do that. And again, that's why it's my #1 priority, so people can have some confidence in it. But also, I was one of the first politicians to start talking about the dangers of inflation.
So you are prepared to see rates continue to rise in order to squeeze inflation. That's what you're saying. But do you admit that that is going to hurt for a lot of people? We're inundated with emails saying their mortgage is going to double. We're inundated with people saying that they can't afford their rent. We're inundated with emails from people saying they're just not going to be able to afford it on top of everything else that's gone up. Now, it might be the right thing to do. You said you're prepared to see it, but do you admit it's going to hurt?
So, first of all, with interest rates, yes, they're going up in the UK, and I fully support the Bank of England in their actions. They're also going up in almost all other countries. If you look at interest rates in Australia, in America, in Canada, in New Zealand, all very similar rates to here in the UK. rates in Europe at the highest they've been for 20 years. So we're not alone in facing this challenge. Central banks across the world are taking very similar
But
action.
do you think that's a comfort for people?
But let me
Because
talk.
that sounds a bit like you're
No, but I'm putting
reading
it
a
in
script.
context. But no, I'm putting it in context. It's important, actually. You talked about me as Prime Minister. Part of my job is to explain to people what is happening with the economy, the context that we're in. It's right for people to know that's the global macroeconomic context. But let's go to the individual person. What are we doing to help? Because, of course, when someone sees their mortgage rate go up, that is going to have an impact on their family finances. Of course it is. And that's why we're putting support in place to help people. Just this week, the Chancellor sat down with the banks to put in place a series of measures that people can draw on. Now, we have the welfare system. There's a support for mortgage interest scheme for people who are particularly vulnerable. But for others, they can now talk to their bank. They can request an extension to their mortgage or a switch to an interest-only mortgage. None of that will have an impact on their credit rating, and it will save them potentially hundreds of pounds a month on their mortgage payments.
Rates have already been going up. Core inflation is not coming down. And the wealthy who've already paid their houses off are going to see interest rates go up on their savings pot. And ordinary families who think they've done the right thing, they've saved, they've managed to get onto the property ladder, they're the people that are going to suffer here. Isn't there an alternative, or is it your belief that there is no alternative to this?
No, there isn't an alternative to stamping out inflation, and that does require...
Is there an alternative to putting up interest rates?
That is one component of what we need to do to tackle inflation. That's what the Bank of England's responsibility is. And it's right that you asked me, my responsibility is also there, and that's to manage the government's borrowing responsibly. Because if I make the wrong decisions, if we end up borrowing too much money, and we talked about public sector pay earlier being a good example of that, if I make the wrong decisions, borrow too much money, that will put further fuel on the fire of the inflation challenge and will just mean inflation is going to be here for longer, be worse, then interest rates will be higher for longer. Now, so that's my responsibility to get right, is government borrowing. And that's why I have to take what are difficult and oftentimes not popular decisions, but they're the right long-term decisions for the country. I'm not going to shy away from that. I spent all of last summer talking about this. I talked about it as Chancellor, and as Prime Minister, I'm going to do the things that will ultimately benefit country and all the families that you talked about in the long term. Because there is no point, Laura, in me doing something that sounds popular and nice today. For example, on public sector pay, I would be giving with one hand and we would just be taking with the other through higher inflation and interest rates. That's not the right type of leadership that the country needs, and that's not what I'm going to do.
But this week you've told people that it's going to be okay. Do you understand why people looking at their mortgage bills, looking at their shopping bill, worrying about keeping a roof over their heads, are going to listen to you and think, it's not going to be okay for me? Doesn't it sound to many people, or might it risk sounding like you're in some kind of parallel universe where the NHS is getting better and the economy is going to be okay? It's not the experience of millions of people right now.
I've never said that it's not challenging. I've never said that this isn't going to be a difficult time to get through, but what I want to give people the reassurance and confidence is that we've got a plan, the plan will work, and we will get through this. That's exactly what people should be hearing from their Prime Minister and their government, particularly from me, given that this particular issue is one that I've talked about for a while. I deliberately made it the first of my 5 priorities, so no one can say this is not something that I'm not aware of, not on top of, and people should have the reassurance that the plans that we've got are the right ones, because they will bring inflation down over time, and they will provide support for the people who most need it as we go through this difficult period. We've demonstrated that already. Windfall tax on energy companies, which has helped pay for around half of the typical family's energy bill. Support worth £1,500. That is the government stepping in to support people in that particular circumstance, which it needed to. The Chancellor's announcements this week with the banks on providing support to people with mortgages, which they should look up, talk to their banks about, it will make a meaningful difference. Extending your mortgage term, switching to an interest-only mortgage, those types of things for a typical family with a typical mortgage have the potential to save them £100 to £200 a month.
So there is support out there from people's banks if they know where to give it. I just want to ask you 2 final questions. And do you think the Governor of the Bank of England has done a good job?
I think the Bank of England's track record, including the Governor's track record, over a long period of time has been that inflation has been managed appropriately, and people should have the confidence that inflation will fall back to target as it is.
Not all of your colleagues think he's done a good job.
I can tell you as Prime Minister, the Bank of England is doing the right thing. The Bank of England has my total support. Inflation is the enemy, for all the reasons that we've talked about. Inflation is what makes people poorer. That's why I prioritised tackling it as the #1 thing that I said in January. And now look, that means difficult things. I could sit here and tell you we could wish it all away. that there was some easy overnight fix. We didn't have to put up interest rates, unlike every other country. I could pay everybody exactly what they wanted. We could spend on everything that we wanted, borrow without abandon. I would not be being honest with the country if I said that. That's not leadership. Now, yes, are things challenging? Yes, does that mean I have to make some difficult decisions as Prime Minister? Of course it does. But those are the right decisions for the long-term benefit of our country. Look, I didn't get into this to do easy things. I didn't get in this for the short-term opinion polls and all the rest of it. I get that this is challenging and that's going to have an impact on me in the short term, but we've got to stick to the course, and I want people to be reassured that we've got to hold our nerve, stick to the plan, and we will get through this.
And I just finally want to ask you about something else that relates directly to honesty and leadership. Now, a clear verdict was given by the House of Commons that your former boss, Boris Johnson, lied to Parliament. Now, you haven't given a view on whether or not you agree with that verdict. So do you agree with that verdict? You've just said that you want to be honest and you want to show leadership. So do you agree?
Yes, I've already said, in fact, that I do fully support and respect not just the work of the committee, who I think did a very thorough job, but also the decision of the House. It's right that
That's
people...
not my question.
No,
Do
but hang on,
you
let me
think
finish, because I think this is important. I do think it's right that people, whatever their position, face responsibility and accountability for their actions. That has happened. And most importantly, Boris Johnson is no longer an MP. Now, you asked me about my view on this, right? And standing up for things, being honest. I was a person that, as Chancellor, resigned from Boris Johnson's government. That is you know this better than most because you follow politics for a long time.
But you didn't bother to vote in the Commons.
I didn't, because I was actually speaking and attending an event at a fantastic charity called Jewish Care, which does an extraordinary job looking after people around the country.
And you could have gotten your prime ministerial car and gone back to the House of Commons
or I could have fulfilled my commitment to these people who are doing an extraordinary job and support their charity and their fundraising efforts, which I've committed to do. But Laura, your point is, do I have to demonstrate my integrity or my leadership? I did that when I resigned. I demonstrated that I was prepared to stand up for what I believe in. You know this, as I said, better than most. You followed politics for a very long time. It is not an easy or common thing for a chancellor to resign from government. I did because I disagreed with Boris Johnson's approach. But let's take one thing, right? I'm telling you, this is really important.
Your critics say, forgive me, this is important. Your critics have said, I'm not saying this, but your critics this week have said that it was weak for you not to go to back the report. What do you say to them?
I'd point them to the example that I've just given you. Right? There was nothing weak about resigning from government when I disagree with the approach. That's principle. Right? That was me acting on my principles. And actually, I'm not interested in litigating the past about Boris Johnson. He's no longer an MP. The choice of the next election is between me and Keir Starmer. Actually, what I demonstrated by resigning from Boris Johnson's government was that I was prepared to stand up for my principles. Keir Starmer sat there for 4 years next to Jeremy Corbyn saying that he was the right person to lead our country. Right? That speaks to his principles. My resignation speaks to mine. We've been talking about inflation. Important and absolutely right. What's the alternative on offer from the Labour Party? £28 billion a year of more borrowing. That would push up inflation and interest rates. Not exploiting our energy reserves here at home. That's not the right sensible thing to do in the midst of an energy crisis. And giving in to unions' unaffordable pay demands. That would be inflationary and push up interest rates. That's the choice confronting people right now. It's not about the past, it's about the future and who is the right person to lead this country. And everyone can see the context that we're in, and they can see that I've prioritised the right things, halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing debt, cutting waiting lists, and stopping the votes. I never said it was going to be easy. I've been doing this for 6 months, but on all of those things, we are making progress, and if we stick to the course, we will deliver for the country.
And I knew that somehow you would get your 5 pledges in there by the end, and of course the Labour Party would dispute a lot of what you've just said, but just very quickly, yes or no, do you think you're going to win the next election?
Yes. Because I'm going to deliver on the things that I say. And the Labour Party can dispute all they want. They want to borrow £28 billion a year. That's going to push up inflation and interest rates. They don't think that we should exploit our energy resources here at home in the midst of an energy crisis, and we should put more power in the hands of dictators like Vladimir Putin. And they also are not prepared to stand up to unaffordable union pay demands. Those are all facts. All of those things would make the current economic situation worse. I also resigned from someone's government when I disagreed with their approach. Keir Starmer sat there next to Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years. Those are my principles, those are my values, and I, unlike anyone else, have actually set out 5 very clear things which rightly you can sit here and hold me account for, which is what exactly I wanted. Now, that is not something that every Prime Minister or every politician does. that I wanted to be very clear with the country about what I was going to deliver for them, and I'm highly confident that we will, and that I'm the right person to do it.
Okay, Prime Minister, the Labour Party would dispute what you just called facts, but we'll talk to them about those on another occasion. Thank you very much for speaking to us today and inviting us to the beautiful